I should have known something was off that night. But who would suspect that sitting around a campfire with friends could turn into a nightmare I'd never wake up from? It all started as the perfect camping trip. 5 of us, old friends, out to escape the chaos of daily life and reconnect under the stars. The smell of pine, the crackle of the campfire, and the cool breeze of the woods felt like the perfect backdrop to our laughter and stories. Mark, Sarah, Ben, Justine, and I, we had planned this trip for weeks, but as the flames cast flickering shadows on our faces, I noticed something strange. There were 6 of us. At first, it didn't register. We were all smiling, laughing, sharing stories from our childhood. But then my gaze kept drifting to one face in particular, one I couldn't place. The man sat at the edge of the firelight, his face partially shadowed, a faint smile playing on his lips. He didn't speak much, just watched, listened, laughed when we laughed, and yet, no one seemed to notice. I tried to focus on my friends. Mark was cracking jokes, trying once again to impress Sarah, who rolled her eyes in mock annoyance. Ben was leaning against Justine, his longtime girlfriend, as she teased him about his terrible sense of direction. It was the usual dynamic, comfortable, familiar, except for him. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Who was this guy? When had he joined us? My chest tightened as I tried to recall. But there was no memory of him arriving, no introduction, no explanation. And yet, he acted like he belonged. "Hey, Porter," Ben's voice snapped me out of my thoughts. "What's with you? You've been staring off into space." "Just tired," I lied, forcing a smile, but my eyes flicked back to the stranger. He was watching me now, his smile a little wider, a little too fixed. Things escalated quickly after that. Ben got up to use the bathroom, disappearing into the dark woods with a flashlight. Questions raced through my mind, none I could answer. How had no one else noticed yet? Why had it taken me so long to notice? Was I going insane? Did I have amnesia and forget this one friend of ours? What in the hell was going on here? Moments later, the stranger stood and said in an oddly strained voice, "I need to take a leak," and followed Ben into the shadows. My stomach churned. Something about the way he moved was unnatural, jerky, like he was still figuring out how to use his limbs. "Do you guys not see what's going on here?" I hissed at Justine and Sarah. They blinked at me, confused. "See what?" Justine asked. "The guy. Who is he? When did he get here?" They exchanged uneasy glances. Justine opened her mouth, then closed it, frowning. I don't know. I thought he was your friend." "No," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I don't know him. None of us do." Before they could respond, a blood-curdling scream shattered the night. It came from the woods where Ben had gone. The sound was primal, raw, a mix of pain and terror that froze us in place. "Ben!" Justine shouted, leaping to her feet. But before she could run into the trees, the stranger emerged from the darkness, alone. His face was calm, his clothes spotless, and he was smiling. "Where's Ben?" I demanded, gripping the axe we'd used to chop firewood. "He's fine," the man said, his voice rasping as though the words scraped their way out of his throat. "He'll be back soon." The way he said it made my skin crawl. I knew he was lying. But at the moment I wasn't sure what to think. I guess I just thought he was a freak. I considered calling him out. Then and there. I wanted to ask him just what the fuck he was doing. But I'll admit I was scared. I had visions of this guy being some horrific serial killer, and I didn't know how dangerous he was, or if he was armed. I didn't want to push him into doing something drastic that got us all killed. As time went by without any sign of Ben, I became convinced the strange man had done something to him. I watched him plotting, planning, and marking his next target. Anger sprouted from my fear, and I started to see red. I needed to stop him. I clutched at the axe's handle. The smooth wood felt reassuring in my hand. Justine touched my arm. "Porter, where's Ben? I'm getting nervous." "It's okay," I lied, patting her hand. "I'm sure everything is okay." At that moment, Ben emerged from the woods. "Ben!" Justine cried. "Jesus!" Ben said as Justine squeezed him. "Did you guys hear that cat thing?" "We think it was an elk," Mark said. "Where were you? Why did you take so long?" Justine asked. "I guess I wandered too far off and I lost sight of the campfire. Took me a bit to find my way back. For a second I thought I was going to have to freeze my ass off out there alone tonight." I looked for the strange man, but he was gone. He somehow slinked away while I was distracted. He was good at going undetected when he wanted to. My thoughts turned to getting out of there. Even though Ben was unharmed, that guy was still trouble. I started back towards the group and caught the middle of their conversation. "I don't know, actually." "Yeah, who was that guy?" Ben said. "I thought he was with you guys," Sarah said. "Yeah, isn't he your friend?" Mark added. "I thought he drove over with you three." "No," Ben said. "I don't know who he is." The panic spread over everyone's faces. They were finally feeling what I was feeling. The realization had set in. "We need to get out of here," I said, "before he comes back." As we scrambled to pack up and leave, the stranger began to change. His smile stretched impossibly wide, revealing teeth that were jagged and uneven. His limbs elongated, his movements becoming even more alien. And then he laughed, a low, guttural sound that didn't belong to anything human. We ran, leaving behind our tents, our supplies, even the fire still burning. The woods were alive with sounds that shouldn't exist, shadows moving where there were no trees. When we finally reached the car, gasping for breath, we thought we were safe. But as we drove down the dark, winding road, the figure of the stranger appeared again, standing in the middle of the lane. I swerved to avoid him, but Mark's car behind us wasn't as lucky. It veered off the road, crashing into the trees with a sickening crunch. I slammed on the brakes and ran to the wreckage. Mark was dead on impact. Sarah was barely alive, her body pinned under twisted metal. And standing just beyond the wreckage, illuminated by the car's flickering headlights, was the stranger. Only, he wasn't a man anymore. His form had shifted into something monstrous. Horns curling from his head, his eyes glowing a sickly yellow, his grin too wide for his face. That was 8 months ago. Mark is gone. Sarah's life is ruined. The rest of us are barely speaking. I've spent every sleepless night since then, researching what I saw. The Goat Man, that's what they call it. A creature of legend, something that takes on the form of its victims, slipping into groups unnoticed until it's too late. I'm going back to those woods. I need answers. Or maybe I just need revenge. Either way, I won't stop until one of us is dead. There were only 5 of us friends since middle school, celebrating our high school graduation with this camping trip deep in the forest. Nothing seemed strange at first. The sky was dotted with faint red flashes, like distant flares signaling from space. We laughed, joking about UFOs as we set up our tents, completely unaware that this trip would turn into a nightmare we'd never forget. We arrived at the campsite and began pitching our tents, while Dave went to collect firewood. He was always the fastest at everything, even setting up his tent. I knew him well. We had worked together at a local gas station for months. Eric, slow but meticulous, was still flipping through the tent manual, trying to figure things out. Ava and Sally had teamed up to set up their tents. I knew every single person there, all of them old friends. There were no strangers among us. But as the sun set, something changed. The forest fell into an eerie silence, as if holding its breath. Dave returned from the woods, carrying an armful of firewood, and looked at us, saying, "Guys, why didn't you set up a chair for me?" I glanced around. There were 5 of us, but all 5 chairs were already occupied. Who was sitting with us? I tried to convince myself that I had miscounted, but the more I focused, the more my mind felt like it was sinking into a thick fog. I wasn't the only one. Everyone else looked visibly unsettled. Even Eric, always calm and collected, was shifting nervously, scanning the group with confusion. "I'll get my own chair," Dave finally said, breaking the silence. I stood up to go with him. Something felt wrong, but my mind refused to fully acknowledge it. "How many of us are here?" I whispered to Dave as we walked toward the tents. He looked around hesitantly before replying in a shaky voice. 5. Right? But when we returned, our chairs were still empty, his and mine. Everything seemed normal again, as if our fears had never existed. We convinced ourselves that we were just exhausted from the long hike, that our minds were playing tricks on us. But it wasn't over. We sat around the fire, drinking and sharing stories, until I suddenly blurted out, "Who lit the fire?" Silence. Everyone exchanged confused looks. No one had an answer. Then Sally muttered hesitantly, "I think the person standing behind you did." I froze. The air around me felt unnaturally cold, despite the warmth of the fire. My skin prickled with fear. I whipped my head around so fast it hurt. But there was nothing there. Just the vast, endless darkness of the forest. Sally's face contorted with confusion. I don't know," she stammered, her voice shaking. Ava put her hands on Sally's shoulders, trying to calm her down, but we all felt it, that creeping, suffocating fear. There were 5 of us, so why did we keep thinking there were 6? We decided to stay together, refusing to sleep in separate tents. We paired up, except for Eric, who ended up alone. He protested, but we insisted he had a partner. The problem? None of us could remember who his partner was supposed to be. "Why do we keep thinking there are 6 of us?" Eric whispered, his face pale, sweat glistening on his forehead. I tried to count us again, but the moment I reached the 6th name, a stabbing pain shot through my skull. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then, a wave of nausea hit me, and I vomited onto the ground. The pain in my head was unbearable, like something was forcefully preventing me from realizing the truth. We rearranged our tents to be as close together as possible, forming a small U-shape for safety. No one wanted to be alone. We tried to convince ourselves that everything was fine, but I knew deep down it wasn't. Before crawling into my tent, I took one last glance at the forest. The trees swayed gently in the wind, and the darkness beyond seemed to shift and pulse, inching closer. And in that moment, I saw someone standing next to the abandoned tents. It wasn't one of us, and by morning, Eric was gone. Ava's shrill scream woke me up in the middle of the night. Dave and I ripped our tent door open to find Sally and Ava looking into Eric's tent. We pushed them aside. Eric's sleeping bag was rolled up. He was still inside it, his head in the center, face contorted in utter agony. The rest of his body rolled around it, with the blue fabric now dripping with dark blood. Dave zipped up the door of the tent. Ava was in shock. Her eyes had become glassy and unfocused. Sally was shaking her repeatedly, tears streaming down her face. Dave picked up his torch and yelled at us to get up and run. We left the campsite behind and entered the trail we had come from. The 5 of us huddled together, Dave leading in the front as he cast his weak flashlight over the path so we could see it. All we had to help us get through this 2-hour trail was a small white circle of light. Even the moon failed to illuminate our surroundings through the dense foliage. Ava tripped and fell, twisting her ankle. We came to a stop. Someone said they knew how to splint it so we could keep going. They dragged her into the woods instead. It happened too quickly for any of us to process. Sally was about to run after Ava when Dave held her back. She struggled and managed to free herself, running into the trees to follow the echoes of Ava's screams. I was about to run after her, but Dave held me by the shoulders and shook me hard. "We need to get out of here, Jenny, please," he said. I hesitated but jolted into motion again when Sally's voice was cut off abruptly. She had been calling out Ava's name as she ran after her. Dave and I continued to run down the trail, trying to get to our car so we could get out of here. There was nothing we could do. At some point, there were 3 of us running on the trail, Dave and I shoulder to shoulder, while someone followed us closely behind. "Dave, who's behind us?" I gasped. My heart was threatening to burst through my ribcage, and my legs burned. He turned to look at me. Confusion transformed into fear on his face, and then into rage. "You keep running," he told me, as he produced a pocket knife from his pants. He handed me the car keys, which I nearly dropped. Then he turned around suddenly and jumped at whoever was behind us. I continued to run in fear as the sounds of a struggle grew behind me. I tripped and tumbled through the trail for what felt like hours. I didn't allow myself to stop. I almost cried when the trail ended, and I walked out into the familiar car park. Not wasting a second, I ran to the car and started it up, accelerating out of that forest and onto the highway within mere seconds. My phone has finally regained service, and I've called 911 to try and explain the situation. I don't think they believe my version of events, but they sent a car my way, regardless. As I wait, the sun is finally starting to rise. It was a hot, suffocating summer night. The air was thick with the scent of damp trees, and the mosquitoes were relentless. My wife, Michelle, and I had decided to go camping at Cherry Hills Bluff, a decision we would soon regret. The day had been long, filled with hiking, setting up camp, and swatting at the endless swarm of insects. As I unzipped the tent to set up our repellent lamp, I noticed something odd. A large chip had appeared in the glass, smeared with mosquito blood. "That wasn't there before," I muttered. But exhaustion got the better of us, and soon we were asleep, blissfully unaware of the nightmare waiting for us at dawn. Morning came, and with it, the unbearable humidity. The mosquitoes were worse than the night before, vicious, almost intelligent in how they targeted us. No amount of bug spray seemed to keep them away. As we hiked up the mountain trail, Michelle groaned, slapping at her stomach. "They're getting under my shirt. This isn't normal." "I know," I said, rubbing at a painful bite my neck. "But once we reach the summit, the wind should keep them away." We pressed on, our legs burning with every step. Up ahead, near the peak, we saw 2 hikers, one in a neon green jacket, the other in orange, sitting completely still. Strange. People usually moved around, stretched, took photos, but these 2 hadn't shifted an inch since we first spotted them. Then, out of nowhere, a man and his young daughter came barreling down the path, their faces frozen in terror. Cor!" he screamed as he ran past us. "What the hell?" I turned to Michelle, but she was already staring at me, her face pale. Todd ... Corey means run. Something cold slithered down my spine. We reached the summit and approached the 2 hikers. The air was thick with a strange buzzing, like the sound of flies over rotting meat. As we stepped closer, the truth hit us like a freight train. They weren't resting. They were corpses. Their skin was stretched tight over their bones, drained of every last drop of blood. And the buzzing? It wasn't from flies. It was from something worse. The cloud of mosquitoes lifted from the bodies, moving toward us in a slow, purposeful wave. "Run!" I shouted. We bolted down the mountain, leaping over rocks and tree roots, the swarm right on our heels. My lungs burned, but fear pushed me forward. Then we saw them. More bodies. Some sprawled across the trail, others half submerged in the creek below. Their skin was gray, paper-air eyes sunken into hollow socket. Michelle gagged. "Oh God, what is this?" "We need to get to the car," I panted. But the mosquitoes weren't the only thing hunting us. As we neared the parking lot, we saw the wreckage of a car smashed into a tree. A woman lay on the ground, convulsing. I took a step toward her, but Michelle grabbed my arm. "Don't." The woman's mouth was open. Something moved inside. I looked closer, and my stomach lurched. Her throat was filled with mosquitoes. They were inside her, writhing and buzzing. She made a strangled sound, reaching for us. But before we could react, another cloud of mosquitoes descended on her, covering her completely. Her body twitched once, then went still. We ran. We crashed through the underbrush, our legs screaming for relief. The mosquitoes were everywhere, their bites burning like acid. Michelle was slowing down, her breath ragged. Then, through the trees, I saw it. Our car. I fumbled for the keys with shaking hands. The swarm was closing in, a black cloud swallowing everything in its path. I threw Michelle into the passenger seat, slammed the door, and jumped into the driver's seat. The mosquitoes hit the windows like a hailstorm, thousands of them slamming against the glass. The buzzing was deafening. I turned the key. The engine roared to life. I floored it. We tore down the dirt road, the swarm chasing us, a living hurricane of death. Then, just as we reached the main road, the fog lifted, and I saw the real nightmare. The highway was a graveyard. Cars were wrecked, doors flung open. People, men, women, children, lay motionless in the streets, their bodies riddled with puncture wounds. And then I saw it. Hovering over a minivan was a mosquito the size of a car. Its abdomen bulged, its massive stinger dripping with fresh blood. My hands tightened on the wheel. "Hold on." The monstrous insect turned its head toward us, its black, soulless eyes locking onto mine. Then it launched itself at our SUV. The impact nearly sent us skidding off the road. The beast slammed its stinger into the trunk, its legs gripping the roof. The mosquitoes swarmed the windshield, pressing so hard against the glass that it started to crack. I reached for the only thing we had left, the broken repellent lamp. I smashed it against the monster's head. Glass shattered. The chemicals inside the lamp spilled over its hideous face. It let out an ungodly shriek and released its grip. I hit the gas, tearing down the road as the monster thrashed behind us. We didn't stop. Not until we reached the nearest town. Michelle and I barely survived. The venom from the bites nearly killed us. Doctors said if we had been even a few minutes later, we wouldn't have made it. The authorities quarantined Cherry Hills Bluff. News reports said it was a freak infestation. But we know the truth. Those weren't normal mosquitoes. Something is wrong in those mountains. And if you ever find yourself near Cherry Hills Bluff, run.